Hey guys, welcome to the third video for chapter 24. We're going to be talking about, this is for section 4. Okay, so we're skipping over section 3, so don't get confused by the difference in the numbering. All right, this is the third video for chapter 24, but the number on the screen is correct. This is section 4. We're going to be talking about the British takeover in India. So the British takeover in India was a bit different from European conquest in Africa. It was much more gradual. It also didn't start with the British military or government, but rather with a private business called the British East India Company. The rise in power of the British East India Company is directly tied to the decline of the Mughal Empire. Mughal Empire was a very powerful Muslim empire in the 16 and 1700s, but we're talking now by the mid 1800s, and it had been in steady decline throughout that time. And the BEIC, the British East India Company, they were able to establish trading rights going back into the 1600s. And then by the mid-1800s, it had control over more than half the country. Right? So you see the pink areas are ones that are in direct control of the BEIC, and then the rest of them were still under Indian states. But you did not have a unified empire in India anymore, and the British were able to use that to their advantage because they were able to exploit Indian diversity. India is a very large country with a lot of diverse people. We kind of don't have a solid understanding of that in the United States. We think everybody from, any country is the same, but that just doesn't work out that way. You think of even within the United States, the amount of diversity that we have. These are just the different languages that they have, so people in one part of India would not be able to understand people in another part of India. And diversity can be a great thing, but it also can make unity a challenge, and the British were able to do that. India does not have a history of strong centralized rule. Much of its history is seen and divided up into smaller areas of control. And the British took advantage of this by encouraging competition and conflict among the different groups in India. The BEIC was not the British government, though. Okay, that's important to remember. It was a private company. It had the blessing of the British government because it was bringing money in, but it was a privately owned company, and it did not have access to the entire British military. What it had to do, therefore, was hire Indian soldiers. And these guys were known as sepoys. They acted as the BEIC's private military force. Now, the British were not particularly sympathetic to Indian culture, and this would lead to a conflict known as the Sepoy Rebellion. Now, shouldn't have put that up there quite yet, but well, we'll just look at it for the entire slide. All right, sometimes also referred to as the Sepoy Mutiny. So this starts because of the British disregard for Indian culture. It wasn't necessarily one thing. There was a kind of a straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, but it was from a long time of just kind of, disregarding aspects of their culture and making the sepoys do certain things that they didn't want to do. Now, as we said, the sepoys were Indian soldiers that were hired by the British, and they subjected them to certain policies that some sepoys found offensive, such as making high caste members travel overseas, which wasn't allowed according to their customs. The final straw that I just referred to, though, was when they started to use animal fat for new cartridges of their rifles. Okay. So you'd have the ammunition in this cartridge, and you see how it's kind of tied off at the top of it up here? It was sealed with animal fat. It was, I guess, easier to do that than with artificial wax like we would do with a lot of things today in order to seal it. And so the sepoys, when they were given instructions on this, they said that you bite off the top of it. Okay, this area up here, you just kind of, rip it off, and then you empty out the inserts of the cartridge into your rifle, and then, you're good to go. Well, this was a problem, though. Because you used either cow fat or pig fat. And cows are a sacred animal to Hindus, and pigs are forbidden to be eaten by Muslims. So they're really 0 for 2, or I should say 2 for 2, in offending their Indian sepoys. So the sepoys, understandably, refused to do these for the cartridges. They refused to use them, and those complaints were completely disregarded. And then when they continued to say, we're not going to do this, they were eventually imprisoned. Now, as I said, this was the last in a long line of offensive against their culture and their religion, and in 1857, the sepoys rebelled. Now, the rebellion was bloody. That's where I should have put this picture up here. There were massacres on both sides. The sepoys killed British men, women, and children who were living there, while the British would go in and completely annihilate and massacre entire Indian villages in retaliation. Now, the rebellion was eventually put down by the British, but it left a really strong bitterness and hatred on both sides. It also had very important political ramifications. It ended control of the BEIC and ushered in direct British rule. So after the Sepoy Rebellion, Parliament ended the BEIC and put India under direct British rule. So this now becomes known as the British Raj. Okay, which is just a term meaning like the British are now in control. It is a direct colony of the British Empire, the same way that like the American colonies used to be a direct colony of the British Empire, right? It's no longer indirectly ruled by a private company. Now, Parliament, Queen, they're in charge of everything. Now, directly in charge, though, a viceroy was put in charge. A viceroy is a royal governor. Okay, obviously you can tell it's a viceroy on the left with one of the local princes on the right, and he speaks with the power of the monarch, right? So whatever he says goes. So he is the direct ruler there in India. Now, British rule in India was not all exploitation and oppression. There were some benefits for India from British rule, such as technology. We think of this namely with railroads, okay, where they expanded the use of railroads in industry. There were medical advances as well. They also improved the status of women, such as banning the practice of sati. Remember, we talked about that last year. Sati was where women would throw themselves on the funeral pyre of their husbands. So the British says, no, that's a barbaric ritual, and so they outlawed it. They also gave rights to lower castes, such as the untouchables. Now, despite some of these improvements, it's important to remember that the relationship between Britain and India was an unequal partnership. The British always took more than they gave back, especially in terms of the economy. The British forced Indians to buy textiles that were mass-produced in British factories, but then took the cotton needed to make these textiles from India. So India wouldn't get paid for its own cotton because, it wasn't trade necessarily. It was a colony, so they said, this is all under British rule. We're just going to take the cotton for ourselves. And then Indians were forced to buy British textiles, which put its own traditional textile industry out of business. So that part of it being an unequal relationship is important to remember. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about British India. This created significant changes to Indian society. Like in pretty much all of their colonies, British culture becomes dominant. They become the highest caste now in the old-fashioned caste system. They are the dominant group. And as I said, with British culture being dominant, you start seeing things such as high tea throughout all of India. The upper-class Indians, though, were encouraged to adopt British customs. Right? You'd see this saying that you see here with the Indian family here, that became very common among the upper-class elites. They would wear the three-piece suits. They would send their children to British schools. They would send them sometimes to Britain to go to school. The picture that I showed earlier in the chapter, right, of a mixed Indian and British polo team. That was very, very common, and as I said, it was also very much encouraged because the British felt like they were civilizing these people to an extent, right? That they were bringing civilization, and so it was in their own best interest to act like the British because the British believed in their superiority. And with that superiority, they looked down on Indian culture. That was clearly apparent in the Sepoy Mutiny, but it didn't end afterwards when it became officially a part of the crown. And this kind of condescending nature, this looking down on them and so forth, that would continue to build Indian resentment, but also build Indian nationalism. And that's going to culminate during the early decades of the 20th century, but we'll talk about that in a later chapter. Okay, so that wraps things up with India, and in the next video, we're going to be talking about European and Western intrusions into China.